Welcome back to our recorded lab demonstrations. We're now moving into the day 3 material dealing with web applications, and we're going to get started with exercise number 1. Now, my computer is actually still open since when we did the first set of day 2 exercises, so I'm just going to close some of this up. And I do need to prepare by getting my Unix web server started. And that's what it talks about there on the very first page of that exercise on page 63. Now remember, you'll be running this right inside of your Windows host on VMware Player, but since I'm running on my Mac here and have my Windows in a virtual machine, I'm actually going to have to start it externally. So I'll just fire that up. There we are. We'll let that get started. And the familiar question about moving or copying, I'm going to try to pick, there we go. Didn't seem to want to pick anything. And off it goes. As usual, we have not rehearsed these or run ahead, so it's going to be, we're going to experience it together, and we'll see how everything goes. Now, while this is starting up, there's some information there on page 63 that's actually quite important. It turns out that when this virtual machine starts up, it's going to automatically generate or capture its own IP address from our system. And in the workbook there you can see that we've circled 192.168.111.152. However, you should not expect your machine to have that same IP address. So we do want to take careful note of the address that this machine comes up with after it finishes booting up. Also, you can see that we have a console here, and if we wanted to, we can actually log right into the virtual machine, though we don't actually need to do that to do any of our labs today. The reason is that we're testing the web application, not the underlying operating system yet. But come to day 5, we will actually be taking a look at this very system and examining the underlying operating system as well. All right, so it looks as though our system is finished booting up, and it's come up with 111.152 as its address. Now that happens to match the workbook, but that's just because I'm the one who wrote the workbook. So that's why I came up with the same address. It's running on the same system where I initially built the virtual machine and did the lab. To test things out, the very first things that it would like to do is actually go and try to connect to that. So we'll find that instruction right on the next page there on 64 at the top. We want to connect to whatever that IP address is that's been provided. To do that connection, I'd really recommend that regardless of the browser you're using, you try to connect to http:// and then the IP address. Because I've found that if you try to do a shortcut and just put the IP address, some of your browsers will not realize that it's actually an IP address and go and search Google or Bing to look that up. That's not quite what you want. By putting the HTTP in front, it insists on going right to that IP address, and there's no question about what we're actually trying to do. Now, if you're successful, you should see a screen that looks exactly like this. For all of the rest of the labs that are in the book, we try to be very consistent with a couple of conventions. One of them is, there is information that is in bold and italics. Generally speaking, the information in bold and italics are things that you should read, and more than likely, a question it's trying to get you to answer, or an activity it's trying to get you to perform. For instance, to click on a button or open a window. On the other hand, you'll find that there is other information that is not in bold, maybe even just in plain text. That's just general information to fill out the story. Of course, I would recommend that you read it, but you don't have to. So if you're just rushing through for some reason, you could skip that stuff, especially if you're a little bit more advanced. You'll also find that in a fair number of the labs that are in the rest of the book, we have some hints. In fact, the hints are often right after the question, though with this particular lab, if you turn over to page 65, there's actually an entire page of hints. Now, don't cheat just yet. Those are actually the answers to this lab, because this is the very basic lab. Now, as we go through these labs, we also we don't want you to think that these are tests. In other words, trick questions. Don't overthink the questions that are here. It's one of the reasons people run into trouble. And actually, the other thing is that if you're not sure what the answer is or what the approach is, quite often reading the very next question will lead you to the answer. So we've really tried to make these self-working labs that are sort of a tutorial to work you through the problem. These labs are also designed as sort of a starting point. So as we work through these things, if you get curious and decide to venture off doing something else, that is exactly what we want you to do. Just look at this as a starting point. Think about why we're asking the question and how you can use that information in what you need to do with your business. Let's get started with the questions we have for this lab. Really, some pretty easy ones. The very first question asks us, are there any hidden messages that are evident? Now, if you think about this question, if the messages were visible, then clearly they would not be hidden. So don't overthink this question. The answer is no. There is nothing hidden that I can see, because if I could see it, it would not be hidden. But that doesn't mean that there isn't any hidden content. So the next question is, how could I examine the page more closely? In other words, how could I see the hidden content? Well, the easiest way is to right-click and choose View Source. Now, that option may actually be in a slightly different location depending on the browser you're using. If it's not there in the right-click menu, try under the Edit menu or under the View menu. Those are the most common locations. Now, moving into this View Source method, is there now content that we can see that was not visible before? The answer is obviously yes. And there's some questions here asking what kind it is, and if we can find some hidden information. So that's the questions 4 and 5 there. Well, let's just look at what we can see. We can now see the actual HTML headers. So those were not visible before. For instance, here's the body tag setting up a background color. Here's a paragraph tag that's creating some the title that shows up on the top of this page. But that's probably not the kind of hidden information we're looking for. Instead, we'd be much more interested in things like comments. I can actually see one that starts right here. Now, the comment that we see in this case, it actually goes from line 6 to line 11. This is called an inline style sheet. Well, or just an inline style. Because if we call it a style sheet, that normally means that it's coming out of a style sheet file. But you'll find both names used. This even is not the kind of content we're looking for, but it's closer. Now, we could just try to scroll through and see if anything jumped out at us. But a much easier way to approach this is to simply use the Control F to bring up our Finder window, and let's search for things that begin with less than, exclamation, dash. Now, we of course were on one of these already, and it's highlighted in yellow, but our next finding is one that says we can change the line below to the location of nlogsearch.pl. All right, just general comment information, maybe some configuration data, but is there anything critical there? I'm really looking ahead to how could the information in our hidden message be useful to an attacker? Yeah, I don't think that would be really useful to an attacker. Let's see if there's anything else. Next. Now this comment says, there's a very serious bug in the OS matching code that could potentially allow a remote user to run arbitrary commands on the system. The CGI below has the OS match disabled, but a copy of the original was backed up. Now that sounds pretty critical. This is one of the things we pointed out in class. We find quite often that programmers comment the most inappropriate things, sometimes even putting vulnerability information right in the source code of the page. And that's what we found in this case. Now, I don't want you to think that we doctored this just for the class. This nlog utility is a publicly available utility that is designed for people to be able to manage nmap results. And this exact comment you can find in the distribution version of nlog. That's very serious. And how could an attacker use it against us? Well, we've just given the attacker information that he could now use to try to discover what perhaps is the name of the backup file. Can he find it? Is it still on the system? Now, if something like directory indexing or something like that is turned on, of course he could find it very easily. But if it's not, he's going to have to maybe start guessing what that file name could be. And he may or may not be able to find it. However, the comments are not the only kind of hidden content we might find. Another excellent keyword to look for is the word hidden. And when we do that, we find that on this page there actually is a hidden element on the page as well. Something called Hacker's Paradise with a name of source. Now, this again is part of the original source code of this utility, and there's no real impact of having this, but it is interesting that there's hidden content sitting in the page. It is unlikely that you're running this tool within your organization, but there is a lesson here from both of these. If you're running something that's off the shelf, like WordPress or BBBB, the bulletin board system, or Big Blue Button, or any of those things, has anyone actually looked at it or done an assessment to see what kind of bad practices might be sitting there right in the page, telling people how to go about attacking it? All right, so that is really the main point of this exercise. Let's close up this window, and I think we have successfully managed to answer those questions, just helping us to get a little bit more comfortable with using a web interface and getting at that view source. As I mentioned when we were going through the class, though, it's going to be very rare for you to have to actually look at the source code. There are other kinds of things you're going to want to look at, though, and that's what we get started with now on page 67 with the man-in-the-middle proxies, part 2 of this exercise. In order to get started with this, I'm going to begin by taking a look and seeing if I already have Java installed. Now, to find that out, there's a sort of an easy way I can do it. I'm going to browse into the 507 stuff that I copied over, go into the Tools directory, and inside of there, under Web Application Testing, I can see one of the tools that we'll be using today. Now, there's actually a few in here. Burp Suite, Wikdo, WebScarab. We're going to use all of those in the class today. And I can see that Burp Suite free is a jar file or a Java file. And the easiest way to see if you have Java installed is to simply double-click. And when it comes up and says, let's give it a second here. Well, my machine's a little slower than usual. It will shortly come up and say that it can't find that. It doesn't know what to do. Strange that it didn't come up. Let me try one more time. Yeah, it's not giving me a message. When it comes up with a message, or I guess in my case, with no message, that means you don't have Java installed. Now that's easy to fix. The workbook tells us that we just need to go out to java.com, and when we do that, right on that main page, we can do a free Java download, agree to start, and you will see that there are pop-ups happening. So you do actually need to run it. The default will be not to run anything you click on. I'll agree, and oh wait, I think I've already done that. I think we're just waiting for it to execute now. All right, so I've just popped up my warning. I'll say yes, let's go ahead and run that. Install. And it actually now has to go and download the installer. So you just download a little stager. That will go get the installer, and probably we're going to get prompted again, and then have to run through the installer. Okay, here we go. So do we want the Ask toolbar? Well, you can do it if you want to, but I sure don't need any extra cruft showing up in my Internet Explorer, so I'm going to turn that off. And now let it run through and do the installation. All right, at this point, my Java installer has finished running. You can see I've just gotten the message up. I will close the installer, and it's now going out to show me that I can verify the Java version. And maybe we'll even do that. Let me enable this script. And it's a little on the slow side, but there we go. So I can now see it moving around. That is definitely Java. I'll go ahead and let that run. Yes, it is. So Java has been installed. Let me close that window up and get this one out of the way. Now, when I double-click on something like Burp Suite, or the tool we're actually going to start with, it's inside of the WebScarab folder here, WebScarab 1. After just a few seconds, you'll see the logo appear. Now, don't worry if your system gives you some warning about the colors having to be changed, or that I see happen on Windows 7 quite frequently, because it's operating in a compatibility mode. And that's just fine. We don't really care what it does with the colors. But now that I've got it running, we're just about ready to go. This tool, this man-in-the-middle proxy, as we talked about in class, is going to be configured to sit between our web browser and the rest of the world. To make that happen, let me just show you that under the Proxy tab, under the Listeners tab, it shows me that it is currently configured to listen on port 8008 on the local host address. And that is always the default. You can actually change that. I'm not going to get into how you would do it, but you can actually change that. However, that is the standard port that WebScarab will use. In order for me to get my system to use that, I'll simply go into my web browser. I will hit the Alt key and pull down the Tools menu, go into Internet Options, and under Connections, LAN Settings, I will tell it I want to use a proxy server. Now at this point, I've actually moved ahead a little bit in the lab, and I'm at page 69 and 70, making the change to the proxy server. And you can see here that I have already populated this with the 127.0.0.1 and the port 8008 that we saw just a moment ago. So with that option turned on, I will click OK and click OK again. What if you're using a system that will not let you change the proxy configuration? Well, if that's the case, more than likely you're using a system that's joined to your domain, and the group policy is restricting you from making that change. Don't worry about it. Instead, the easiest way to approach this is to go and download something like Safari or Firefox or Chrome or Opera, and just run that alternative browser, because that one will not be controlled by your group policy. But with that change made, I should now be able to connect to a website and see activity inside of the WebScarab interface. So I'm going to move the WebScarab interface over, and I'm going to go back to the Summary tab, which is where it starts by default. Then inside of Internet Explorer, I'm going to connect to http:// and I'm going to put in whatever that address was that you had in your virtual machine. So for me, it was 192.168.111.152, and it tells me there on page 70 to add the word bank to that. I'll press return, and did you notice that in the background things were happening? That is exactly what we should see. Now, if you get an error at this point saying it can't load the page and there was no activity back here, then chances are you've incorrectly configured the proxy. I do find quite often that people will miskey that as 8080 or something like that, because that's a much more typical port for a proxy. So just verify that that's correct, and then just come back to this point. At this point, though, we now are able to successfully intercept the communication that's happening between these two machines. And one of the first things we see is that just opening this single page actually generated 10 separate requests. What exactly are they? Well, we can look for ourselves. Let me make this window a little bit bigger as well. We can see that many of them had to do with images. An icon, the GIF for the professional window, the clear pixel, another professional op. And if we wanted to, we could double click on any one of these. How about this one? And when I do, it's showing me here at the top the communication that went from the client to the server. At the bottom, it's showing me the data that went from the server to the client. And then here in the bottom, it's showing me what actually passed by. In this case, since it detects that that was an image, it shows me the install guide image. That image, if we look at our page, shows up right here. So that's pretty convenient. Now there is actually another way to see that information. I did it by double-clicking, but if I close this up, I can do exactly what it says there on page 71 and 72. It actually suggests that we go to the bank, the /bank/ page, which we can see had a status of 200 OK, meaning that it actually got the page. As compared to my actual request, which was for bank without the slash, that returned a moved permanently. What's that? Well, let's take a look. If we right-click and show conversation, we get exactly the same view that we get if we double-click. And rather than looking at the parsed version, I typically prefer to look at the raw version. So here I can see that I asked for that URL, the very one I typed, and the server said to me, that resource has moved. It is now located here, /bank/. And your browser, without you knowing, automatically knows to follow that link when you get a 301 message back, which is why, if I move this back to parsed, we never saw this page show up in our browser. While I'm looking here, though, there's some questions. The questions on 72 are asking things like, what kind of information is revealed? Well, if I look up here at the top, I can see that there's HTTP being revealed. I can see the actual question that my client made. And I can see included in that the user agent uses. Curiously, even though it's Microsoft Internet Explorer 10, it also says it's Mozilla. It's trying to show what it's compatible with. I can also see other information about the system. For instance, that it's NT 6.1, that it's running on a 64-bit system. So there's lots of other data my client is revealing, even though it has no impact on how the server will perform. Similarly, in the returned information, I can see the HTTP followed by the HTML. And in this particular case, we could see data that never showed up visibly within our browser. Of course, we can use this tool to retrospectively analyze anything that happened, and people do ask, so I'll just tell you now, absolutely, you can keep this running while you browse and do things on the internet. Though when you do, if you go to an SSL encrypted site, you will get a warning. Let me click on the more information. The reason in this case, well, let me continue to the website and then come up here and, let's see here. Click on the certificate and view the certificates. It's telling me that this is an OWASP custom CA for this machine. Well, the reason is that this certificate is actually coming from WebScarab. It's acting as a man in the middle. Normally, if you went to Google and got a certificate error, you would never click through. But in this case, it's okay. We know what's happening. So you can continue to browse the internet and search for things. And as I type, you can see that there's lots of queries going on back here. And if you wanted to, we can look at any one of these and see what's actually happening. Now, the one thing I'm going to warn you against is that while you are free to run this and observe the data that's going back and forth, do not manipulate the data that you are sending to the server. Because if you begin to do that, and it is something we're going to do throughout the day in looking at our applications, that absolutely would be crossing over the line and be considered hacking. But that's how easy this is to do. All right. We'd like to move on, though, to the second part of this exercise, because on page 72, it actually asks us to take a look at another tool, Burp Suite. Burp Suite is also on that DVD, so I'm just going to run it. We are using the free edition. Now, the free edition does have some limitations. One of them is that it doesn't have the security scanning expert that continually gives you updates and information about problems it's seeing, and it actually is a very good web application vulnerability scanner. The other thing is that many of the different tests that it will do are rate limited, so they will not run as fast as they would in the full version. All right. Now that Burp Suite is up and running, let's take a look at what we need to do to get it working, and we can find some of that on page 73. The very first thing I'd like to point out to you is that if we switch over to the Proxy tab and look at the options, we find that the proxy is running on port 8080. That is not the same as WebScarab. So in order to use it, we will need to again go in and modify our proxy. Of course, there are tools that you can get to automatically make proxy changes and even add menus for it. I'll change this over to 8080, so we're now talking through Burp Suite. And you could even do something called Proxy Chaining, though I'm not going to do that in the lab, especially not with all these virtual machines. What that means is that I could perhaps tell my browser to talk to WebScarab and tell WebScarab to talk to Burp, and then Burp can go out to the internet. That means that I have both tools running at the same time, looking at all of the same data. So that can simplify things a little bit, though it will run more slowly. With that change done, I'm going to try to go back to our bank site. Now I'm going to warn you, this is not going to work. Oh, it did work. Well, let me try to hold down I believe it's the Alt key and the refresh button. Now when I do that, surprisingly, the Burp Suite interface came to the front. That's surprising because all I did was click on a button in the web browser. What does the Alt refresh button do? It tells the browser, I don't care if you have cached content. Go out to that server and get a fresh copy right now. And when it did that, it made Burp come to the front, and you'll see that the Proxy tab is highlighted and the Intercept tab is highlighted. And the reason is what is discussed on page 74. The default configuration for Burp is that the interception is turned on by default. The interception is exactly what we were just looking at very briefly, or I'm sorry, we haven't looked at yet in WebScarab, but is the ability to now intercept the data while it's passing by. So if I forward that request, I can see the web page populate. What this means is that if I click on another link, once again I can see that Burp down here is flashing, and there is another request waiting to go by. Burp always tries to tell you what's important and what to investigate by trying to light up the top level menu that's involved, and then beneath that, whatever tab actually needs your attention. Again, it's choosing to intercept things. One of the things you may want to do just as a habit is when you start up Burp, begin by going into the proxy intercept configuration and turning intercept off. If you do that, you will then be able to more easily browse through the web application without having it continually pause and wait for you to make a change over in Burp. There are reasons why you would want to intercept data, and some of that was demonstrated in the class so far. So if you'd like to experiment a little bit more, feel free. But at this point, let's just go back into the History tab and replicate some of what we did in WebScarab. You'll see that the interface is very similar, giving us very similar kind of information here. And additionally, I can again double-click to bring up the content. It also shows it down here in the bottom, but I personally prefer to bring it into its own window because it gives me a little bit more real estate to work with. I can view to see the request itself, raw, or maybe parsed out as parameters or just the headers, or even as raw hex data, and the response. Again, as raw, headers, hex, HTML, or render. And one of the things that you'll find with Burp is that the rendering is actually more complete, but could be misleading. Why do I say that? Well, if I take a look at the raw data, all that's really in this particular packet is the HTML. There's no pictures in here. What is in here are image links telling it where to find the pictures. So what has Burp done? When I choose render, it actually goes and gets those pictures and inserts them into the page so that it will fully render for you. So just be aware of that, because otherwise you could be misled into thinking that all of this data came down in that same request, and that's not quite true. There are other things you can do in here, but we'll cover a little bit more of that a little bit later. Hope you're doing well so far. That's the end of this particular lab. As you continue to move ahead, we'll next take a look at exercise 2 dealing with CGI scanning, and then finally application fuzzers, which will be the last thing that we do for today.